Welcome into Words with Wallace. I am your host, Nick Wallace, coming at you. It is Saturday, June 29th. What is up, everybody? Hopefully, you guys enjoyed the NBA draft. If you're like me, that was the first time seeing a lot of those guys, but seems like a spunky group, right? Hopefully, they have a lot of success in their NBA career. Was thinking about recording a pod about this time last week before the draft, but then again, I really didn't know much about those guys. And with my Celtics obviously winning the title a couple weeks ago, I really haven't spent a ton of time doing draft research. I really have just been kind of basking in the glory of my Celtics. So, with that being said, I figured it would make more sense to just do a podcast today with the draft behind us, kind of give my reaction to some of the picks that I did think were notable, some of the guys that I do know a thing or two about, want to give my thoughts on that, as well as free agency, right? This is arguably one of the most exciting times of the year for the NBA fan, right? The NBA is known to be extremely dramatic, so we are going to have some superstars changing teams. That is almost a certainty. There's going to be more trades. There's going to be a lot of drama within the next couple of weeks. And it all starts in a couple days, right? On July 1st is when all this kicks off, 2 days away from the start of free agency. So it felt like it'd be a good time to get some predictions out there as well. And so honestly, not going to spend a ton of time on the draft. Like, again, I don't know a ton about these guys, but we did have a ton of trades in advance of the draft that I thought were pretty interesting. So let's first and foremost go through some of the notable deals that have taken place within the past week or so. The first notable deal that took place was a trade, a one-for-one swap between the Chicago Bulls and the Oklahoma City Thunder, in which the Bulls received Josh Giddey for Alex Caruso, who is now going to be on the Oklahoma City Thunder. So again, Caruso to the Thunder, Giddey to the Bulls, one-for-one swap. And honestly, I like it for both sides, right? OKC gets an incredible guard slash wing defender who is coming off the best three-point shooting season of his entire career in Alex Caruso. And we all saw kind of what happened with Josh Giddey in the playoffs. The consensus NBA fan is probably a little bit lower on Josh Giddey than what they should be. Obviously, minus all the off-the-court stuff, which it doesn't seem like, regardless of what you know or think about that, doesn't seem like Josh Giddey is going to face any repercussions in the NBA anyways for whatever happened there. So that being said, headed back to OKC here. Josh Giddey got played off of the court in the playoffs last year, right? The Dallas Mavericks did not respect him as a shooter whatsoever, and how good of on-ball playmaker he is not as important to the Thunder when you have a guy as dynamic as Shea. And Giddey just doesn't really fit in with that group like he did a couple years ago. Right now, it's clearly Shea's team. J-Dub is a really great compliment, and they just want to surround Shea and J-Dub with as much defense and perimeter shooting as possible, and that's what the Thunder did with this deal. So I do like Caruso. I think he is more valuable to the Oklahoma City Thunder than Josh Giddey would be, but I do like it for the Bulls as well. I feel like a lot of people initially clowned on the Bulls a little bit for this trade because of, again, the off-the-court stuff with Josh Giddey, which, again, just putting that to the side for now, I think Josh Giddey is a much more valuable asset independent of teams than Alex Caruso, right? He's 21 years old. He's a 6'8" guard who in just his second season put up 16, 8, and 6. And so he could easily end up being an elite player and playmaker in this league. And if you're the Chicago Bulls, you want somebody younger, you want somebody with some real upside, somebody you can eventually build the team around a little bit. Again, I don't think he's ever going to be like, a top 2 player on a championship team, but he can still be a really good player. Great rebounder, obviously, for the guard position, and just the size and switchability of him. If he improves on defense a little bit, you'd much rather have a 6'8" point guard than a 6'2" point guard, just because of what they give you on the glass and on the defensive end of the court as well. And so I think there's a lot of upside with Josh Giddey. I think he fits the timeline and the direction of the Bulls a little bit better. Obviously, the Lonzo signing for the Bulls has been a nightmare, and to no fault of the Bulls or Lonzo, it's just a really sad injury situation. But if he never returns to form, which honestly at this point it's looking unlikely, Giddey can step into that role and be really solid for the Bulls. So I do like it for both sides. I've actually seen a lot of comps head back to the Thunder here to the Boston Celtics, right? A lot of people are like, hey, look, people are recognizing how the Celtics built this team, how they were so dominant this past season, and you have a really dynamic playmaker in Jason Tatum, and then you have a secondary creator, a really great all-star level talent in Jaylen Brown, and then you surround those guys with high IQ, defensive players, guys who can hit an open shot and switch everything, right? That's what the Thunder are trying to recreate. They have obviously the dynamic creator in Shea. They have their number 2 guy in J-Dub. And then, of course, they have their big man in the middle who can still space the floor in Chet Holmgren. And now you have kind of stepping into that Derek White and that Drew Holiday role, you have Lou Dort and Alex Caruso. So I do see the blueprint, but I am going to be a little bit defensive of my team and saying The Oklahoma City Thunder still have a massive flaw that the Celtics don't have, and that is how they are able to rebound the basketball. That's been the bugaboo for the Oklahoma City Thunder really this entire past season. They just don't have a lot of size out there, and they actually got smaller and a little bit worse on the glass, in my opinion, going from a guy who is 6'8" and Josh Giddey to a guy who's 6'5" and Alex Caruso. And what the Celtics are able to do on the glass is really all comes back to Jason Tatum. I know I defended him a lot on my last podcast, so bear with me for a second. I mean, that dude is really special on the defensive end of the court with his ability to guard centers a lot of the time, and certainly the other team's power forward, and just his ability to get 7, 8, 9 rebounds a game, really no matter what. That's what Jason Tatum provides, where nobody on the Thunder is doing that, right? You have, Shea, who's 6'6", J-Dub, who's like 6'6" as well, and then you have two guys that are 6'5" or shorter in Caruso and Dort. I just don't see any of those guys stepping up and suddenly becoming an elite rebounder as much as of a hustler as Alex Caruso is. And so the Thunder are eventually going to have to get a backup big man that they can play at the 5 with Chet at the 4 in some spots if they want to get better on the glass. And just somebody to, like I've been saying since the trade deadline last year, get a backup big to relieve Chet, hang against like a Jokic or a Gobert or a Karl Towns and bang bodies, 6 extra fouls. Somebody in the vein of like a Nick Claxton or a Jared Allen would be awesome for this Thunder team. And that's who they still need to acquire. And they need to at least have that guy coming off the bench where they can pivot to a lineup with a little bit more sides and a little bit more rebounding chops, because that is definitely the Thunder's biggest weakness. And I understand they're trying to recreate the Celtics, but the Celtics don't have that problem on the glass because of how good Jason Tatum is on the glass, especially. So wanted to make that note. I like the move for both sides, and so wanted to cover that trade first. The next deal that we have to talk about is the completion of the Villanova Knicks, right? Mikal Bridges is officially a New York Knick, and he was a part of a deal that sent Bridges as well as a 2026 second-round pick to the Knicks in exchange for Bojan Bogdanovic, unprotected first-round picks in 2025, 2027, 2029, and 2031, a pick swap in 28, and a top 4 protected 2025 first-round pick via the Bucks, and then an additional second-round pick in 2025. That's a very steep price to pay for Mikal Bridges. However, that's just kind of the price of what it takes to become a contending team in the NBA, which I think the Knicks just did. And now I know that some people might be a little bit down on Bridges just because I think he performed a lot better right after he was acquired at the 2023 deadline by the Nets, right? He immediately joined the Nets as part of that Kevin Durant trade and was fantastic. He was averaging basically like 25 points per game to close the season. And then this past year, he kind of heads into the offseason, heads into the season as clearly the number 1 overall option for the team on paper anyways. And it just didn't really break out like that. Like Cam Thomas ended up being their best scorer most nights that he was active. And Bridges just didn't really look like he had what it took to be like the 1A on a really good team, or at least a decent team, because I wouldn't even give the Nets that credit. But that being said, I still think that experience of Bridges being arguably the top option for the better part of a season and a half is going to be a good experience for him. Guess what? He's never going to have to be the number 1 option probably ever again in his career, and certainly not next to Jalen Brunson. So the fact that he is still a super versatile, elite defender from the wing position, shoots the ball at a great clip, and now his playmaking chops and his shot creation chops are a little bit better because of the time that he spent with the Brooklyn Nets, I think that makes him, if anything, a more valuable trade asset. He has 2 more years left on his contract, and again, the chemistry with the Nova Knicks, we'd imagine that's going to be pretty good, right? It's no secret that he's really good friends with his college teammates, of course, Jalen Brunson, Josh Hart, Dante DiVincenzo. All those guys played together at Villanova and now have the makings of a contending team in the NBA. And so this move to acquire Mikal Bridges actually coincides with another massive move from the franchise, their decision to re-sign OG Anunoby on a 5-year, $212 million contract extension. So as you can tell, the Knicks are basically all in, right? That is a pretty risky move for OG, just given his injury history. Like, if he plays, he's probably worth that because there's some really awesome stats that support how good the Knicks were with OG Anunoby last year compared to him off the court. It's really not all that close. And with Brunson as the centerpiece on offense, and then you surround him with 2 switchable, versatile wings on each side of him, essentially, with OG and Mikal Bridges, and you still have some really great guys that might even come off the bench in DiVincenzo and Hart. That's going to shape up really well for the New York Knicks. And just, again, kind of adapting to what the Celtics are doing, having guys that can guard 1 through 5, having guys that can switch, and having guys that are able to space the floor as well. And so It is worth noting, heading back to what Brooklyn received, I really like what the Nets were able to haul from this, right? 2 years left on Bridges' contract. A lot of people expected him to get dealt this offseason, and for them to get what? It basically ends up being 5 firsts for Bridges, is just to sum it up, which a lot of those are going to be late picks. It is worth noting. The Knicks are as competitive as what they are shaping up to be and what they project to be. You're looking at most likely late round picks for at least 25, 27, and 29. By 31, that's really too far out for anybody to know. The real move that I think really takes this to the next level for the Brooklyn Nets is a second trade that they were a part of with the Houston Rockets. And this was purely a exchange of draft capital between the Nets and the Rockets, in which the Nets receive their own first round pick back for 2025 and 2026. Those are picks that originally were sent to Houston as a part of the James Harden trade a couple years ago. And in return, the Rockets are receiving the 2025 right to swap picks, which likely it isn't going to come into play here. A 2027 first round pick of the Suns, which I'm sure the Rockets are thinking might end up being very valuable here if the Suns kind of implode within the next couple years. And then the rights to the two most favorable of Mavs, Suns, and Rockets first round picks in 2029. So essentially, the Rockets get a couple extra picks. It was also rumored that the Rockets were going to then look to trade for Kevin Durant now that they have the Suns pick and stuff like that. So that's interesting. I think that's a lot of smoke. I'd expect Durant to stay in Phoenix and don't want to get ahead of myself here. But what that allows Brooklyn, again, getting their first round picks back for 2025 and 2026, they now hold their destiny, right? They are in the driver's seat. They have a real direction. And that direction is tanking. It is going to be tank city for the Brooklyn Nets. They traded away their best player in Mikal Bridges. They got a bunch of firsts from the Knicks from that. And more importantly, with this deal with the Rockets, they have their own pick. That's why there was so much mystery around the Brooklyn Nets about what they wanted to do, because without them having their own picks, it didn't really make sense for them to try and bottom out. Now it does, but I really like that move for the Nets. I mean, that is a no-brainer. Like, that is sending them into a full-on tank. I just kind of wonder what information the Rockets received in which they felt comfortable giving Brooklyn back those picks. But either way, the Nets now have two of their own first-round picks back over the next couple years, 5 additional picks from the Knicks and over the next several years, and I think it's a great haul. Like, that is a humongous win for the Nets, and the Knicks become a real contender. Moving on to a whole nother trade here, we have to talk about the deal between the New Orleans Pelicans and the Atlanta Hawks, which actually just took place yesterday. In that deal, the Pelicans received DeJounte Murray, and the Hawks received Larry Nance, Dyson Daniels, a 2025 first-round pick via the Lakers, and a 2027 first-round pick via the Bucks or the Pelicans, whatever one is less favorable. So basically, DeJounte Murray is shipped out in exchange for 2 late first-round picks over the next couple years, and Dyson Daniels and Larry Nance. And so, look, it's no secret, I just don't like DeJounte Murray. Like, I really can't stand the guy at all. He's really cocky. I think he's a bit overrated, but even I must admit that I do kind of like the deal for the Pelicans. He's obviously a lot younger than CJ McCollum, much better length and size defensively, and I think he just kind of fits into the pace that the Pelicans want to play at a bit better. The defensive options that they have with DeJounte Murray, Herb Jones, Trey Murphy, Zion Williamson, and whoever the man is ends up being in the middle for the Pelicans, like, that's going to be a really dangerous 5-man lineup. And it gives you a guy who's a little bit younger who you can depend on. Whether I like DeJounte Murray or not, he had some clutch performances. A few of those came against my Boston Celtics last year, so he can be kind of like an end-of-game guy in certain situations. CJ is still under contract for a couple more years, but at this point, he might be a trade target for a lot of teams out there. I don't know how much he fits into the Pelicans core and what his comfort level is coming off the bench. If he does come off the bench, I think he's still really valuable for the Pelicans, but needless to say, like, their primary guard playmaker is now going to be DeJounte Murray. From the Hawks' perspective, again, getting Larry Nance, Dyson Daniels, and a couple late firsts, like, it really just kind of shakes out to what you think of Dyson Daniels, I guess. Like, I'm not super bullish on him. I can't pretend to be like a Dyson Daniels expert. He has really great size at 6'7" as kind of like an off-ball guard. Like, he defends at a higher level than I think even DeJounte Murray, to be totally honest with you. And so he is probably a better fit next to Trae Young, but he definitely needs to make significant leaps, namely on the offensive end of the court, for this deal to make really any type of sense, especially unless the Lakers like completely implode, but they would have to implode this year. And no matter what, since you're getting the less favorable of the 2027 picks via the Bucks or the Pelicans, like, that's not going to be an early first either. So altogether, the most damning thing I can say about the Hawks is that, like, the DeJounte Murray experience was clearly a failure, right? When you include what they had to give up to get the guy in the first place, like those were picks that were much more valuable than ultimately the picks that they ended up acquiring back when they traded away DeJounte Murray, and the lack of success they had for those two DeJounte years. Like, it's just kind of a joke for the Atlanta Hawks, but that's not too surprising. They haven't been a very competent franchise lately, to say the least. So, two more deals to talk about here. These ones are a little bit less notable. I just thought it was kind of interesting that Deni Avdija was sent to the Portland Trailblazers. In exchange, again, the Washington Wizards received Malcolm Brogdon, the 14th overall pick, which they used for Bub Carrington, a 2029 first-round pick, and then 2 seconds. Kind of an interesting move here. Like, I know people seem to really like Deni Avdija. I know my guy Brendan is extremely high on him and tells me that all the time, whatever. I do just kind of think that it would make more sense for really any other team besides Portland. I know that you're allowed to improve your roster even if you're not contending for a championship, and clearly Portland is one of the bottom barrel teams in the NBA, but it is interesting to see them move on from Brogdon as well as some draft capital for a guy that just kind of plugs into their lineup, like assuming he starts at the wing position alongside Jeremy Grant, which could, again, it gets them more competent, it gets them a guy that they think has some upside, but I just don't know how much sense that makes. I just don't really see why Portland was the team to go out and get Deni Avdija. Maybe I just wanted to see him on a contending team to see really how good this guy is playing meaningful basketball. And I think a lot of teams that are competing would want Deni, but it seems like he's going to Portland for the foreseeable future. And so as far as the Wizards side of things, like, look, I'm sure Deni didn't want to be there because who does want to play for the Wizards at this point in time? So they get some draft capital for him. And frankly, I don't know how long Malcolm Brogdon sticks around there. I mean, I kind of expected Brogdon to get traded from Portland last year, and he lasted the whole season. So maybe the Wizards can still flip him for somebody else, despite all the health issues. Like, clearly Brogdon is still a really valuable player when he's healthy. So this could end up being a really nice haul for Deni Avdija from the perspective of the Washington Wizards. Finally, the last trade that we're going to talk about, it's certainly not high profile names here, but I do think the team is very relevant because it does include your reigning Western Conference champions in the Dallas Mavericks. The Mavericks actually picked up Quentin Grimes from the Detroit Pistons in exchange for Tim Hardaway Jr. and 2 second-round picks. I really like this deal for the Mavs. I think it's no secret, especially after watching the NBA Finals, that Tim Hardaway Jr. is clearly washed, and you're getting a guy in Quentin Grimes who actually can provide you like a solid defensive option from the guard position off the bench. And I think as far as your role of like your bench scorer, like I think Jaden Hardy steps into that role next year and was clearly already better in that role than Tim Hardaway Jr. by the time the end of the season rolled around. So Hardy kind of has that confidence like, hey, I'm the spark off the bench coming into the game next year. And I think Grimes can provide similar, if not better, 3-point shooting than Tim Hardaway Jr. I just swear to God, every time I watch Tim Hardaway Jr., that guy sucks. I don't exactly know what the 3-point percentage is, but I know Grimes can shoot it a bit, and he does provide a little bit more defensive upside with the absence of Frank Ntilikina. I know he had a little bit of a resurgence in the Mavs a couple years ago. Now you have a real defensive guard you can kind of bring off the bench. If people are giving Kyrie buckets or Jaden Hardy buckets, maybe Grimes can provide some defensive resistance. So I think it's really a no-brainer for the Mavericks. From the sake of the Pistons, like, you traded for Grimes at the deadline. You didn't do a whole lot there. It's kind of interesting you'd move on from him that quick, but look, they get a couple extra seconds, and Tim Hardaway Jr. can be a veteran in that locker room, I guess is the best thing I can say about it, even though I think the dude is washed. So that just about does it for all the trades. I think there were a bunch of other trades as well during the draft itself. Most of them involved like second-round picks and teams maneuvering around there, and a bunch of dudes that even I'm not familiar with. So frankly, I didn't think it was worth going into all those trades. The only one that really caught my eye was a deal between the Hawks and the Rockets, in which AJ Griffin, who's a former first-round pick of the Atlanta Hawks, is being sent to the Rockets in exchange for the 44th overall pick. I just kind of like that move for the Rockets. I know that's a Duke guy, so maybe I'm a little bit biased toward him, but AJ Griffin obviously had a lot of health issues this past season, but he did have some flashes in his rookie season, and I think it's just worth it to trade the 44 overall pick in a really weak draft for a highly recruited kid out of high school, a highly drafted guy by the Atlanta Hawks and AJ Griffin. So I like that move for the Rockets. Now let's talk about the 2024 NBA draft. And honestly, my strongest draft opinion is pertaining to the decision to now make the NBA draft a 2-day event. I think that is some of the dumbest shit I've ever heard, to be totally honest with you. Like, suddenly, every single year, forever, in the history of the draft, it's on a Thursday night. Just like the NFL draft, the NBA draft is always on Thursday night. There's some tradition there. There's some history there. I loved it. Now suddenly it's a 2-day event where they're breaking up rounds 1 and 2, and instead of going Thursday, Friday, they went Wednesday, Thursday. Like having the draft on a Wednesday screwed up my whole week. I honestly like didn't even know about it until basically the day before. I'm like, oh shit, the draft is tomorrow. Like I hated it. I hated the idea. I'm putting my conspiracy hat on, and I'm very much curious if it is a 2-day event next year. I really wonder if this is just such a unique case where the most famous person who was drafted was LeBron's son, Bronny James, and knowing that he, in all likelihood, was going to be a day 2 pick, or a round 2 pick, rather, the fact that that was the reason why the NBA actually made that a 2-day event, like just because of Bronny James, and then they go back to a 1-day event next year. I don't know. I hope it goes back to 1 day either way, just because there's some history there. Nobody really cares about the second round of the NBA draft, even people like me. Like, again, the odds of these guys making an impact are so slim. It's not like the NFL draft. It actually makes more sense because there's just so many more players on a football field. There's more players on a football roster. Whatever. I just can't stand the fact that they made it a 2-day event. Rant over on that. Now, let's kind of fly through the top picks in the draft. I'm just going to read to you guys the top 17 picks in order, and as I go, just kind of give you my brief thoughts and then some additional picks that I thought stood out to me beyond the top 17 guys. So let's start off with the number 1 overall pick, in which the Hawks drafted Zachary Risacher. The biggest thing this draft was missing was just a clear top guy. Like a clear top guy for somebody to hitch their wagon to and be like, he is the prize, and that is obviously absent from this draft class. And I don't really know what I see in Risacher. Like, he's a 6'8" guy. He's from overseas, whatever. It's like you close one eye, he's really skinny. It's like, okay, maybe Brandon Miller. Like, that's the comp everybody's like saying. It's like, I kind of see it, but I don't know. It doesn't seem like he's good enough at any one thing to have a tangible skill that he can have as his go-to when he starts his NBA career. And that's really all I'll leave it on, because I don't know much more than that. Maybe the guy ends up being good, but he certainly is going to be a much less of a prospect, a lower quality prospect than really any first round pick we've had the past several years in the NBA draft. And I'll leave it at that. The second pick in the draft ended up being Alex Sarr, who comes overseas from Perth. This is a guy where at least you saw more of the physical tools, right? Like, he's 7'1". He has like a great frame on him. He's like a pretty special defensive prospect with just kind of his rim protection. The offense is a little shaky, and I think more of the damning things with Sarr kind of come with like the personality traits, namely just his decision to not work out with the Hawks whatsoever. Like, this guy Alex Sarr basically told the Hawks, like, don't draft me. And the Hawks were like, bet, we'll take Risacher, whatever. Maybe they were going to take that guy anyway. But it's just kind of weird. Like, from a basketball standpoint, I feel like I can successfully analyze the difference between the Washington Wizards and the Atlanta Hawks. And I don't really see why you'd want to go to the Wizards over the Hawks. Like, you can, even if Sarr is really raw and doesn't have any offensive skills, which, you know, that might not be too far off from the truth. Like, worst comes to worst, like, doesn't he just kind of slot into like the Clint Capella role, and Trae Young, assuming he's still in Atlanta, makes him look really good next year? Like, no hate to Clint Capella. Like, he's a great defender. He's a fantastic rebounder, whatever. But offensively, he's clearly very limited. And having a guy who's even bigger and more athletic than Capella in that dunker spot seems like it would be the logical fit for Sarr. Like, is he worried about being behind Clint Capella? Like, I don't think that really makes sense, because there's going to be pressure on a mediocre team like the Atlanta Hawks to just play the dude that they drafted number 1 overall if it ended up being Sarr. So there's kind of like an anti-competitive thing going on with him, and he bounced around on a bunch of different teams and has played all over the place, and people kind of hold that against him, which maybe you're right. Maybe you're right to point into, like, look into that a little bit when all these guys are kind of on the same playing field as a prospect. But at least he had the physical tools, but he told the Hawks not to draft him, and they didn't. And so he ends up with the Wizards, which, again, like, obviously, yes, he's going to step in on the Wizards and accumulate stats because the team sucks or whatever. But I'm assuming he would have basically the same leash with the Hawks as well. So I just don't understand that decision from Sarr. But whatever, could be a pretty special defensive prospect. At 3, the Rockets took Reed Sheppard, a dude that, honestly, again, didn't watch a ton of college basketball, but I do think John Calipari should have to pay reparations to the University of Kentucky for his decision to have Reed Sheppard, who went number 3 overall, and Rob Dillingham, who went number 8 overall. He had both of those dudes coming off the bench for Kentucky this past season. So yeah, I don't know what Cal was on. I'm really starting to see the full picture with the Kentucky fans who kind of soured on him toward the end of his run with Kentucky. But whatever, Sheppard can shoot the hell out the ball. He's a little undersized at like 6'2", 6'3". But it seems like he does everything really well. Like, he's a great athlete. He has really great defensive instincts, besides the fact that he is undersized, so presumably he's not going to hold up. on a team like, again, just comparing it to the Celtics for the sake of a team that just won the title, like, Peyton Pritchard, who was very skilled and not nearly as much of a prospect as Reed Sheppard, like, that's a guy who played like 5 seconds in the closeout game of the NBA Finals, despite being productive in the regular season, because in the playoffs, especially, I think we're going to gravitate toward larger lineups being out there. And so you can hold that against Reed Sheppard, but he can shoot the hell out the ball, man. He's fun. He seems just like a really smart basketball player that's probably going to figure it out. And obviously, the Rockets aren't that worried about their defense because that's always going to be Ime Udoka's default as head coach, along with the front office, like getting guys in the building that they trust out there to defend at a high level. And so maybe he thinks Reed Sheppard can figure it out. I know he had some actually sneaky good steal block numbers as well. So I really like Reed Sheppard as a prospect. I think he could have a really high upside with just how dynamic he is as a shooter. But number 4, Stephon Castle. This is one that, again, he went to the Spurs at number 4, I should mention. I didn't love this pick. Again, I care more about the Spurs than really any other team at the top of the draft just because I know I'm going to watch them a ton because of Wembanyama, no matter who they have surrounding him. So I was just kind of hoping the Spurs were going to like take somebody fun and exciting. And they got Castle, who's going to be a really good defender. He's a great competitor. He's a UConn guy, right? So obviously he's been a part of some title teams, whatever. I just kind of would have liked to see somebody with a little bit more consistent perimeter shooting, at least to start, to get that better spacing around Wemby. But hey, maybe he ends up being a good guy. The Pistons, it is kind of funny. They draft Ron Holland at number 5, who comes over from the G League at Ignite, and he's a guy that's struggled to shoot the ball as well. So it just seems like when people play the Pistons, if you just like blur out the screen a little bit and you watch a Pistons game, it might look like 2005 basketball out there with the amount of non-shooters that they have. Like you have Asar out there, you have Cade and Jaden Ivey, who aren't great perimeter shooters, and then it just really seems like if you were trying to build the best team around Cade, you get as much perimeter shooting as possible. Duren is obviously a staple of that team. He's a non-shooter, so interesting to see how that works out. Again, Holland could figure it out, and apparently he's really competitive. The Blazers draft Donovan Clingan out of Connecticut at 7. Don't have a ton of thoughts there besides like what kind of happens now with the big man rotation. They have Rob Williams, they have DeAndre Ayton, and now they have Clingan, who's obviously huge. So I'd expect at least one of those guys to get moved. Obviously, probably not Clingan since he fits the timeline of the team. But I would expect either Ayton or Rob Williams to end up on another team before the start of the season. And then we got to talk about pick number 8. And I think this one's pretty interesting, right? It's actually the San Antonio Spurs who were slotted in at the number 8 spot in the draft. And they took Rob Dillingham. But it was announced that this pick was actually acquired by the Minnesota Timberwolves. So they trade into the number 8 pick in the draft Rob Dillingham out of Kentucky. Dillingham is like a 6'2", 6'3" guard who's really skinny and is just incredibly fun to watch. Like this dude is like total jitterbug out there. He's super fun to watch. He's kind of like a Jamal Crawford-esque scorer, playmaker, pretty good shooter as well. And so he's just like lightning in a bottle, to say the least, right? To compare him to the great Patty Mills, a former San Antonio Spur as well. I really like Dillingham. At least he's extremely fun to watch. So again, when I'm watching the draft, I'm rooting for the Spurs at the very least to draft somebody fun. And I'm like, oh, this is sick. They got Dillingham. That's perfect. They have a playmaker to handle the ball on the outside. And then I was pretty shocked to see that Minnesota traded into that spot. It is worth noting that to pay the cost to get into that spot for the Minnesota Timberwolves, they traded a 2030 pick swap as well as a 2031 first round pick that is unprotected to get into that spot. And I just like don't understand this move from the Spurs perspective. Like, look, I get it. This is a weak draft. Everybody's been shitting on this draft for over a year now, right? And then the Spurs trade out of what is known to be a very weak draft and everybody makes fun of them for it. But like, it just doesn't make sense if you're the Spurs. Like, why did you want a Minnesota 2030 or 2031 pick? It's not like you can really project anything once you get out to the 2030s, right? So why did you want that pick for that year? Like, this is the time now to be taking swings. You have holes all over the place on your roster as a San Antonio Spur. And I think Dillingham, whether you like him or you end up going with somebody else in that spot, like, he's a playmaker. He's somebody that can handle the ball from the outside. He's somebody that can create his own shot. Like, you're desperately lacking those guys in Spurs uniforms right now. And just with Wemby on the team, like, it just makes sense to take those swings now. And guess what? It's expensive to pay guys. Like, it remains to be seen if guys are going to want to sign with the Spurs in free agency. So if you can bring a guy into the building that has at least elite playmaking chops, like, why wouldn't you want to do that? Or at least take a swing on somebody at this point in the draft with how many holes you have. So I didn't like that move from the Spurs. From the Timberwolves perspective, I really like it, right? Like, who's to say what that 2031 pick ends up being? Like, and again, just a pick swap and a pick, like, that is really nothing to get into the top 8, even in a really weak draft. And I think Dillingham's going to be really fun to watch. I already described his game. So the fact that he's kind of stepping into that, presumably bench guard role where maybe like you saw Shake Milton earlier in the season get some of those minutes. You saw Jordan McLaughlin get some of those minutes. You saw, who is it, Monte Morris get some of those minutes as well towards the playoffs. He kind of steps in and maybe he takes over that backup guard spot. I mean, number 8 is still significant draft capital, right? And I know he plays nothing like Mike Conley, but it is really nice to know that they have like a true veteran point guard who young players in the league should want to emulate, like a veteran who actually matters in Mike Conley. Like he's clearly that. And so he can learn a lot from Mike Conley. He can learn a lot from Anthony Edwards. And guess what? Rob Dillingham is super fun to watch. So putting him next to Anthony Edwards, as much as I wanted the Spurs to be more exciting and fun to watch, I think the Timberwolves ultimately will gain a couple more eyeballs this year because of how fun to watch they will be when Rob Dillingham and Anthony Edwards are on the court at the same time. The Grizzlies at number 9 drafted Zach Edey out of Purdue. I mean, the guy's a giant. I think it is kind of interesting that they get a massive dude that can't really move all that well to play alongside Ja Morant, who just wants to push the pace no matter what. And the Grizzlies are normally a fast-paced and exciting team. So that's kind of like the catch there, I guess, is that I just don't really see it from an offensive perspective. From the defensive end, if you have Zach Edey and Jaren Jackson on the court at the same time, like that's going to be really tough for other teams to score, even if you are pulling Jaren Jackson away from the rim quite a bit, because Edey's obviously going to have to play that spot with his foot speed. So that's interesting. The Jazz draft Cody Williams at number 10. He is the brother of Jalen Williams, the J-Dub, if you will, on the Oklahoma City Thunder. At number 11, the Spurs draft Matas Buzelis of the G League Ignite. At number 12, the Thunder drafted Nikola Topic. They obviously traded away Josh Giddey, who was an oversized point guard that can't shoot all that well, and so they drafted another oversized point guard that can't shoot all that well. Now, Topic is going to miss the entirety of his rookie year because he did get injured. I think he tore his ACL or something like that late in this past season, so he's not going to play for a while, but it is kind of funny that they immediately draft somebody to fill that Josh Giddey pipeline. At 13, the Kings draft Devin Carter, somebody that I've heard a lot of guys be high on Devin Carter, say he's a really smart player. So we'll see if he can be a really good guard off the bench for the Kings. Maybe he even ends up in a starting role. It remains to be seen what happens with Kevin Huerter. I know Malik Monk just signed there as well. At 14, the Trailblazers draft Bub Carrington, and that was a pick that actually was traded over to the Washington Wizards. At 15, the Heat draft Khalil Ware, a big man out of Indiana who I believe can shoot the ball quite well, so that could be a decent pickup for the Heat. At 16, the 76ers drafted Jared McCain out of Duke. He's kind of like if Juju Smith-Schuster played basketball. I will leave it at that. He's certainly not my cup of tea, so way to go, Sixers fans. I'm sure you'll love him there. Finally, the reason why I stopped going through this exercise at 17, because at the 17th pick in the draft, the Lakers drafted Dalton Knecht out of Tennessee, who was, I believe, at least a 3-year player. Maybe he even played 4 years at Tennessee. But this dude was a stud in college, like a really great shooter, a really great scorer. Obviously, he's a bit older. I think he's already 24 years old, or will be 24 years old by the time the season actually starts. But Knecht is a bucket. And so for a Lakers team that, again, they're really competitive. They have a pretty good roster. They're relatively deep. Like, it's going to be really hard for any rookie to crack a rotation for them, especially, halfway through the first round in what's supposed to be a pretty weak draft. Like, Knecht fell, I think, at least 5 to 10 spots more than where people originally had him mocked at. So it's kind of a layup pick for, obviously JJ Redick and Rob Pelinka right there. JJ, the first draft pick that JJ's a part of. Of course, he's going to want the shooter, right? That's kind of a no-brainer. And so I really like that move for the Lakers. I really do. Like, that was a layup for them, and they didn't let Knecht fall any further, and they grabbed them, and I think that was an awesome pick. So now we have a few more other notable picks in the draft outside of the top 17. I just went through that draft order there. At 30, I have to show my Celtics some love. They took Baylor Shireman out of Creighton. He's kind of like Joe Ingles meets Dennis Rodman, right? Like, clearly the dude's like an elite rebounder. He averaged like 8 or 9 rebounds a game his entire college career. Obviously, I'm embellishing it a little bit. He does have a unique lefty jump shot where he does kind of look like Joe Ingles when he's shooting the ball. He's 6'6", but honestly, he looks a lot bigger than that. The dude's super wide. He's an older guy, but I think he could slot in as eventually as like our Sam Hauser replacement. Again, hopefully we have Hauser on the team at least for next season, but beyond that, I think Sam Hauser's destined to get a bag from somebody in free agency the next couple of years whenever he's actually an unrestricted free agent. And so getting an older guy in the pipeline who can shoot the ball at a high clip and can be like eventually a wing Hauser type replacement player, I do like that pick. At 32, the Utah Jazz selected Kyle Filipowski from Duke. Crazy stories coming out of Kyle Filipowski. I'm not gonna lie. I'm not gonna go into the full details on that on this podcast here, but I recommend looking it up. Some really weird controversy around this guy that probably led to him falling quite a bit. He was definitely projected as a first round guy out of Duke. I'm not going to say much on the story, but I'll just leave it at the fact that Utah is a really good landing spot. It's really very fitting for Kyle Filipowski. That's all I'll say. And then finally, I am obliged to talk about the Lakers selecting LeBron's son, Bronny James, at pick 55. And so, first and foremost, I am not surprised to see this draft pick. I think it was pretty obvious. I was actually watching it with my boss as we were grabbing a drink after work on Thursday, and he's like, are they going to do it? Are they going to do it? I'm like, yeah, I think so, Rob. I think they're going to end up taking him. And of course, they ended up selecting that pick. Is it nepotism that got Bronny drafted by the Lakers? 100% yes. Should we really care about it? No, we should not really care about it. If anybody deserves the right to demand his team to draft his son or demand his team to draft anybody, it's LeBron James, right? Like, and it's not the first time that he's done this, right? He's had veto power over roster decisions and draft picks and everything like that for the better part of like 20 years now. Like, he's had that say with the Cavs the first time, he had that say with the Heat, he had that say with the Cavs the second time, and now he has that power with the Lakers now. It's really not that surprising. And I don't blame LeBron for making this happen, first and foremost, right? Like, this is objectively cool. It's a cool moment. Maybe I'm just getting older now because I'm certainly not a LeBron guy. I'm certainly not a Laker guy, but I think it's objectively really cool. I wasn't old enough to really be aware, and baseball's not my thing anyway, for Ken Griffey and Ken Griffey Jr. Like, but the fact that those guys played together and apparently had a home run in the same game, like, that is so unbelievably cool. And as much as you want to, maybe shit on the Lakers for doing this and say, they're grabbing headlines or say it's nepotism or whatever, like, do you really care that much? Like, this is going to be an awesome moment when they both check into the game together for the first time. And it's pick number 55 in a crappy draft. They didn't have to draft Bronny in the first round. They didn't have to make like a series of trades just to like grab a pick to do it. The Celtics were picking at 54, and ultimately they could have done the funniest thing ever and grabbed Bronny James there or whatever. But ultimately he fell in their lap at 55. Like, the Lakers didn't really have to do anything. And especially when you were talking about a competing team, the odds that these second round picks, especially once you get to the 50s, like, the odds that these guys make an impact, it's like a 90% chance they end up doing nothing for the team anyway. So what is the harm in keeping your franchise player happy, keeping one of the all-time greats happy, continuing the Laker legacy of like showing that they support their star players no matter what? It's a no-brainer that you draft LeBron's son, especially when LeBron and his agent Rich Paul and Bronny's agent and Rich Paul is one of the most powerful agencies in the league with Clutch. Like, you want to keep those guys happy as well. Like, it's a no-brainer. And then finally, like, look, I understand the college stats suck. Like, he averaged like 5, 3, and 2 in like a handful of games for a crappy USC team this past year. Like, when you look at that production, obviously Bronny James, just looking at that, does not deserve to get drafted. But it's been noted for a very long time. Like, look, he's always been one of the top ranked prospects in his class, even during high school. Can you make the argument he was probably a bit overrated because his name has been Bronny James forever? Yes, probably. But there's no doubt he's one of the top players in what's been a weaker class. And look, the kid had like cardiac arrest right before his college season started. And obviously there's a lot of recovery and ramp up process to get back to playing speed, and just like the mental aspects that come along with a near death experience on a basketball court. And the fact that he was able to push through that, like, look, there is real potential with this guy. He was that, even if that medical event doesn't happen, maybe his career or his year at USC goes a little bit different. I'm a little, bearish on that, but whatever. The guy wasn't a scrub. He has a real prospect, and guess what? There's worse bets to make than the son of one of the greatest players ever, who has already proven to have like really good defensive instincts. He's 6'3", whatever. He has a lot of athleticism. Like, the odds that that kid, with all the resources that are available to him, figures it out, like, that's not a bad bet to make. So I just wanted to kind of defend the Lakers and say it's a cool moment, because I think that it all makes total sense, dude. Like, anybody crying about it, like, maybe you just don't like the Lakers or whatever, but like, let them do what they want to do. It's LeBron has earned the right to draft his son, and it's going to be a really cool story. I think the interesting and the more cynical look I have on this is, how long does this really last, right? Like, obviously, if Bronny ends up somehow producing, which is a total long shot, like, that's great. Then maybe he can be a backup guard and, give you 5 to 7 minutes, depending on the night, whatever, and give you some decent defense. And that's great. If he actually finds a way to contribute at the NBA level, then this isn't a conversation. But assuming he takes the trajectory of most 55 overall picks in the NBA draft for a competing team, Like, does he enter Thanasis territory where he just has that roster spot forever moving forward, no matter what happens? Like, then I could see the hate continuing to build for LeBron. Like, if the Lakers are struggling and, the coach and JJ's struggling and they're looking for answers. And, again, people are just like looking at Bronny's roster spot. Maybe they can use that for somebody else. Like, I'm sure that people are going to talk about that. But again, the nepotism is all over the place. It's all over front offices. It's all over coaching staffs. You literally see it with some roster decisions like you do with Thanasis. Like, even if like Bronny ends up being like the permanent 13th man for the Lakers, like it's still not going to be a big deal. I honestly think that the decision to draft Bronny is less egregious than the decision to hire JJ Redick as the head coach of the Lakers. So let's talk about that. I've obviously mentioned it a couple times here, but if you missed it, JJ Redick is now the Lakers head coach. Obviously, the Lakers they fired Darvin Ham. They took a big swing very publicly on Dan Hurley, and that kind of blew up in their face. But I don't really knock the Lakers for doing that either. I mean, clearly Hurley's got some shit figured out at UConn. Has a chance. He's already done something that nobody besides John Wooden has ever accomplished, if I'm not mistaken, at the college level, winning back-to-back national championships, and has a chance to three-peat, which is unlikely, but we'll see how that happens. Regardless, I don't blame them for making a swing on Hurley, who's clearly a great coach. But they end up pivoting, and they sign JJ Redick, LeBron's podcast co-host, a podcast that I've talked about on this feed as well. Their Mind the Game podcast, LeBron and JJ Redick. And who am I to evaluate how good JJ Redick is as a coach? I understand that. I'm not telling you he's not going to end up being a good coach. I'm telling you with relative certainty that he is not going to be a good coach this season. And it just kind of signals to me that with the decision to hire JJ Redick, the Lakers are kind of moving in that Dallas Cowboys direction where they are more concerned with getting as much attention, as many eyeballs, as many voices talking about the Los Angeles Lakers at all times than they are about winning a championship. Because I don't think it is even possible for a rookie head coach, especially with the lack of experience that JJ Redick has. His only real coaching experience is coaching his sons, who are like 12 or something, or maybe even younger, like literal like elementary school kids is his coaching experience. The learning curve for anybody, any rookie head coach in the NBA is insane. The Lakers are like they're punting on this year. Let's call it what it is. They're not going to win a championship with JJ Redick in his rookie year. It's just not going to happen. And you're just comfortable punting a year right now with this core of LeBron and Anthony Davis. Like, how many years does LeBron have left? I would never doubt LeBron, but it can't be that many, at least at the level that he's producing and how he produced this past season. So it just seems like they're leaning into that Cowboys territory of like, look, I think they know that they're not going to win a title with this current team. It's not possible for LeBron and Anthony Davis to play any better than what they played last year. And sure, maybe they sign a big name here or they get another guy, but I don't think it ultimately changes the destiny of this Lakers team. And I'm not even a guy that likes to write off old teams, but for them to hire a guy with no experience whatsoever coaching at the collegiate level, high school level, professional level, whatever, it just signals to me that that's the direction they're going. They'd rather have people talk about the team as much as possible. They'd rather bring in the flashy name from ESPN. They'd rather bring in LeBron's podcast co-host, and they'd rather just have LeBron, be comfortable having him for the twilight of his Lakers career. Fuck it. Let's draft his son too and have him on the bench. Let's just get as many people talking about the team as possible. That is the mindset I think the Lakers have heading into this season. Again, before I let you guys go, we are just 2 days away from the official start of NBA free agency. So I wanted to give you guys a couple of predictions, right? I have some sources that I'll talk a little bit more about and some of the predictions I feel really strongly about. But in reality, like there's going to be a ton of stuff that takes place over the next couple of weeks that nobody sees coming. And so obviously come back to Words with Wallace where I will react and give you my analysis of the moves that transpire, how it affects the team's chances of winning and all the big moves that take place over the next couple of weeks. You'll have updates on that here. But since it's before any of this really started, let's do some predictions. Let's have some fun with it. What do we know about free agency so far? Let's start off with Klay Thompson, right? It was announced a couple hours ago at this point that he's headed for an expected breakup with the Golden State Warriors. I think it is kind of sad. I'm not going to lie. Like, that's officially the end of the previous Warriors regime, which I had a lot of fun watching over the years from, high school into college and everything like that. But I think ultimately it's the best for both sides. And it's announced that there's 3 teams that are kind of leading the pack in the Klay Thompson sweepstakes. I've seen the Lakers listed as some. I've seen the Clippers listed, and I've seen the Mavericks listed. My prediction is that Klay Thompson ends up with the Lakers. I think he has family ties there. He's from LA. I think his dad has a role with the Lakers team currently, and he still wants to win, right? It gives him the opportunity to compete, if you will, with that current Lakers roster. Obviously, JJ is not going to be shy about trying to get another shooter on the team, and I think that's kind of where Klay goes. So obviously, Klay is going to, in all likelihood, play for a different team at the start of next season, and I am going to guess it's going to be the Lakers, but we're going to find out in a couple of weeks on that. Next, we have the Paul George sweepstakes, and I think this is probably the biggest name in all of free agency, especially with the news that came out today. It was announced today that he declined his player option for this season, which basically ruled out, like, obviously him just returning to the Clippers and playing for the short-term contract, which probably never was going to happen. But it also kind of ruled out, like, a sign-and trade. Basically, it makes that kind of impossible. So now, like, Paul George is actually a free agent, right? He's either going to re-sign with the Clippers, likely for a longer-term agreement, or he's going to end up with other teams. And the other teams that are interested in Paul George, at least publicly interested in Paul George, have been noted as the Philadelphia 76ers. That's been floated out a ton, as well as the Orlando Magic. I actually do think that Philly gives Paul George the best chance to win. I think the situation for him, again, it's a long shot to assume Joel Embiid's going to be healthy at this point in time, but if he is, like, obviously he's a very dominant player when he's healthy, I think he can literally be like the third option on offense with how good Tyrese Maxey is. I think Tyrese Maxey might end up just outright being a better player than Paul George, especially on the offensive end of the court next season. So for him to, like, he's so inconsistent. That's, like, again, my guy Dime Dropper does a great job covering the Los Angeles Clippers. He goes to a ton of games. I believe he's a season ticket holder. He covers the Clippers on the Locked On Clippers podcast. And his biggest gripe about Paul George, as somebody who watches the team more than anybody else, is how inconsistent he is, right? Like, some games he looks awesome and we see all the slow-mo Paul George highlights on Instagram and whatever. And then other games he totally disappears. And you can't really afford to do that when you're a first or second best player on an NBA team. But when you're the third option, like he would be for the Sixers, I think that puts him in a decent spot to win. And he's obviously in the weaker conference from top to bottom, right? So I think that gives him the best chance to win. I think the most fun would be the Magic, right? For them to get like an actual veteran star to go along with like their young developing supporting cast. I think that'd be a lot of fun, but I think it's pretty unlikely that he ends up going to Orlando. To be honest with you, I think Paul George ends up staying with the Clippers. I think that he has a lot going for him off the court. He clearly cares a lot about his podcast P, if you will. And him being in LA, I think is probably more conducive to that, if I had to guess. I mean, I guess even if he was with Orlando, he'd probably just spend his summers in LA or whatever. But either way, I think the Clippers can pay him the most money. The Clippers are just going to talk themselves into like, oh man, like Kawhi wasn't healthy again. Like, let's run this all back. And they care more about having like as many stars in the roster as possible as they head into like the rebrand and the new arena and everything like that. I think they want Paul George in the building, and I think he ultimately ends up staying with the Clippers. But again, the Paul George sweepstakes has begun. We will see where he ends up. Now we have to talk about the Cleveland Cavaliers, because I have some ESPN inside sources that are telling me that they fully expect Donovan Mitchell to re-sign a long-term agreement with the Cleveland Cavaliers. So that is quite the shift in where we were at with Donovan Mitchell a year ago, or even at the trade deadline. There were still a lot of people expecting Donovan Mitchell to be moved and traded because they didn't expect him to re-sign, but it seems like Donovan Mitchell might have had a change of heart and he might be comfortable with Cleveland. He obviously was really good in the playoffs against the Orlando Magic and even had some really great games against the Celtics before getting hurt. And clearly he is the number one on that team. Like, he is the best player on that team. He is the best option for that team. And he is a really dynamic player that anybody would love to have. I don't think you can necessarily win with him as the best player on a championship team, but there's a very short list of guys, as we've discussed ad nauseum on this podcast. So I do expect the Cavs to re-sign Donovan Mitchell. I think that's basically a certainty. And with that, what I'm telling you guys is I expect them to now move Darius Garland. I'm sure that he might want a change of scenery. I think the fit is a little clunky between him and Donovan Mitchell, and I think there could be some other guys you could get alongside Donovan that could be a better basketball fit. And I think a lot of teams still really like Darius Garland. I think he had a tough season with him breaking his jaw last year, and coming back from that injury isn't easy for a small guard. And so I would expect Orlando and San Antonio to be top suitors to get Darius Garland. And I really like watching both of those teams. So, I just kind of hope that Garland ends up with them so the Spurs or the Magic end up being really fun to watch. But I think he'd be a huge boost. So I am expecting Mitchell to re-sign with the Cavs, and I am expecting them to trade Garland. Next, we have to talk about Brandon Ingram, because even though this guy is not technically a free agent, his time with New Orleans has to be coming to an end. Like, it's like the worst kept secret ever that like his time in New Orleans has come to an end and they don't want him there and he's not really a fit there and whatever. and he only has 1 year left on his contract. If he's going to walk and be an unrestricted free agent this time next year, they should trade him now if possible, or at the very least trade him at this upcoming trade deadline in February. And so sources are telling me this as well, that the Houston Rockets and Ime Udoka is not convinced on the long-term fit with Şengün in Houston, which I'm a little surprised with, given just how talented I think Şengün is. I think you can obviously poke holes in his defense and being like the true anchor to a defense. I don't know if Şengün will ever be that, but I don't think Ime likes having him all that much. And I would expect at this point, my prediction for Brandon Ingram is that he ultimately is traded to the Houston Rockets in exchange for Şengün. I'm sure there's going to be some draft picks. I'm sure if anything, the Pelicans are going to have to contribute some of those draft picks because I think Şengün is a much more desirable asset at this point in time. But Şengün playing alongside Zion could be a lot of fun. And Brandon Ingram could give a huge boost to a Rockets team with him having a change scenery as well. Next, we have two more big name free agents. I guess these guys are a little bit over the hill at this point, but still big names nonetheless. We have James Harden, who's an unrestricted free agent as well after the fiasco offseason that he had. I'm sure he's looking for a long-term deal. I'm sure he's not going to get it, but I'm sure that he's going to end up with the Clippers. I think that's where he ends up staying. It has been announced that he, as in James Harden, is going to make that decision after Paul George decides. But I just think that the Clippers end up running it back. I think they end up keeping both Paul George. I think he decides to stay there. And then I think Harden decides to re-sign with the Clippers as well. I just don't know how many other Harden teams are out there. I'm sure he likes to play in Los Angeles as well. And I don't think that the Lakers fit makes any type of sense for him. And I'm sure he wants to stay in LA. So I'm predicting that James Harden stays with the Clippers. And then finally, I do think that Orlando is going to be active in the free agent market, but I think they're going to strike out with some of these bigger name guys. But I think they end up with DeMar DeRozan. I think DeMar DeRozan's a pretty good consolation prize. I think like a real veteran that's been around for a long time. He's been super productive and has had effectively the same season for like the past 5 years, right? Like his production really hasn't changed despite the fact that he keeps getting older. He's a really solid player, a really great end of game player that can get you some good shots, especially from the mid range. I think he'd be a fun fit for Orlando. He obviously doesn't give you like the 3-point shooting that you'd love to have, but he does get you, still shooting some on-ball creation as well. And I just really like DeMar DeRozan. I think he'd be a fun fit in Houston. So I'm just going to guess that he goes to the Magic. And that just about does it for this podcast, right? Some free agency predictions before we part ways here. Just wanted to get that out into the universe. And we'll see how it all plays out, man. I will be back next week with updates on the first few days of free agency. I don't know exactly when I'll record next. It kind of depends on just how many splashy signings there are within the first couple days. And I'll try to find a good stopping point in that action and get you another podcast where we cover all those moves and analyze how it's going to affect the next year's season and go from there. But before I let you guys go, be sure to follow Words with Wallace on everything. That includes Spotify, Apple Music, wherever you get your podcasts. On social media as well, be sure to subscribe and follow the show there. That includes YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, TikTok. Be sure to support the show on all those platforms. And I will talk to you guys next week. Peace.